Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to cover lesson 13-3 on version control with Git and GitHub. The learning objectives for this lesson include understanding the purpose of version control and why it is very important and popular in software development, create a GitHub account and a GitHub repository, learn the basics of the Git command line interface, and interface with GitHub Classroom. So let's talk about version control. What is version control and why should you care about it? Version control is a system that records changes to a file or a set of files over time so that you can recall specific versions later. Now let's pause for a second and think about a time in the past where maybe you have implemented your own version of version control, or you really wished you would have had version control. So a very simple hack to implement your own version control is to maybe write some code in a file and then decide you're going to try something rogue, something different, and you make a copy of that source file, and then you start your work in this second copy of the source file. If this new work happens to be correct and you like it, then you'll continue developing in this copy, and this will become your main version of your program. You may go back and delete that previous version once you decide you don't need it. Now, in the other case, perhaps this new rogue version that you're working on in the copy doesn't happen to work out, in which case you probably will ignore it, leave it on your system, or you may delete it, but you'll go back to work on that original version that you made a copy of when you were about to try something rogue. So that would be an example of version control. You're essentially keeping track of your different versions so that in case you need to, you can revert back to an earlier state of your code. Now, the Git website provides an example here of why version control might be important if you are a graphic or web designer and want to keep every version of an image or layout, then a version control system is a very wise thing to use. It allows you to revert files back to a previous state, revert the entire project back to a previous state, compare changes over time, see who last modified something that might be causing a problem. You can imagine this would be very important when working in teams if you're not the only one who's touching the code base. See who introduced an issue and when, and more. Using a VCS also generally means that if you screw things up or lose files, you can easily recover them. In addition, you can get all this for very little overhead. So Git is one of the most popular version control systems out there, and it's the version control software that GitHub is built on. GitHub is a code hosting platform for version control and collaboration. People from all over the world can work together on projects, and code that is hosted on GitHub can be either public or private. Now, you have had some exposure to GitHub in this class because I host my Jupyter notebooks on GitHub, and I explained how that worked with Notebook Viewer, NB Viewer, towards the beginning of the class. Now, first thing we're going to do is go ahead and go to GitHub by clicking on this link here or type github.com in your URL in your browser and make a GitHub account. Code hosted with a free GitHub account is public by default. That's what I'm using for my GitHub account, GSprint23, where I host all of the Jupyter notebooks for this class. It's a free account, so my repositories are public by default. But if you perhaps want to make an account where you have private repositories or your code is private to the world or just available to a select number of people, then you can upgrade your GitHub account from a free account to a pay-for account, or you can use GitHub Enterprise, which our EECS department has. If you click on github.eecs.wsu, it will bring you to a page where it's going to ask you to sign in. Your sign in here will be the same credentials that you use for your EECS email. Moving on, I want you to get your feet wet working with GitHub, so I've included this link to a Great Hello World tutorial that is hosted by GitHub Guides, so you know it's good. This tutorial is going to walk you through creating a repository, creating a branch in a repository, committing to a branch, and then creating a pull request, and merging a pull request back into your master branch. So go ahead and pause the video now and work through this Hello World tutorial. At the end of the Hello World tutorial, you should have a repository called Hello World on GitHub. That should look something like this, and you'll have opened your README file and done some modification to it. I added a link to an image. Hopefully you decided to do something fun in your README file because you are quite familiar with Markdown from your Jupyter Notebook experience so far in this class. Next, let's move on to talk about Git. So far, you've done a tutorial on GitHub using its browser interface for simple node code edits. You were editing some Markdown code in the README file. But more commonly, you'll be writing code locally on your machine, like you do when you develop code for this class. You'll then want to push the code changes from your local repository to your repository on GitHub via a command line interface. And we can do this with Git and Git commands. So in order to use Git, you're going to have to install it on your machine. So follow this link here. There's support for multiple operating systems. Next, just like I did for the GitHub Hello World tutorial, I have a link for a great Git tutorial. This will actually walk you through some of the basic Git commands on the command line to work with your local repository, and then it will describe to you how you can upload or essentially link your local Git repository with a repository on GitHub using the remote add command and push and pull. So once you have finished this tutorial here, if you feel like you want some more practice with Git and GitHub, there is another tutorial to check out on Udacity that I've included here. And then take a look at this graphic, which I love. I think it's really great. We're only going to be working with the commands above this line here. So pull, everything above pull should be somewhat familiar to you after completing those 2 tutorials, or 3 if you decide to do the Udacity tutorial. So let's just review a little bit of what you've learned. So take a look at this row here. We have the workspace, the index, the local repository, and the remote repository. So your remote repository in the tutorials you've worked today is your GitHub repository. Your local repository is your local Git repository on your machine. The workspace is the folder directory where you are essentially managing your project and writing your code. And when you are working with a file that you want to be version controlled, then you add it to the index. And this is the Git index that's keeping track of all of your files that you have told it to track. So we use the add command in order to add a file to the Git index. Once we are ready to commit the changes we've made in a file or files to our local repository, then we use the commit command to commit those changes to the local repository. Now, these changes are still local to our machine. They have not been pushed out over the internet to the real world. If we want to do that, we can use the push command to push the current state of our local repository to our remote repository, which would be our GitHub repository. Now, if there are multiple people who are committing changes to versions of your GitHub repository and pushing those changes to the GitHub repository, then every so often you're going to need to pull those changes down from the GitHub repository into your local repository and into your workspace so that you're working with the most up-to-date version of the code. And we do that with a pull command. Another example of why you may need to pull code from the remote repository, even if you're not working with other people on this repository or this project. Remember in one of the previous tutorials, we edited the README file and we committed that change in the GitHub, in the browser via GitHub. That wasn't done locally. So we can actually modify and make updates and commit changes to our GitHub repository in the browser. So in that case, you'll need to pull down that updated README file or any changes that are made browser-based versus maybe that came from you or from a collaborator from a local repository. Now let's talk about GitHub Classroom. Briefly, it'll be our last topic related to Git and GitHub. GitHub has a site called GitHub Classroom that we'll use in this class. It automates repository creation and access control for assignments in courses like ours, where we want our students in Computer Science 215 to gain experience working with GitHub, because likely you're going to be on a data analytics team from people all over the nation or even all over the country, and you're going to need to version control your software development in order to keep track of progress and be able to recover if something should happen. So these repositories on GitHub can be public, meaning public to the world, private to the students in the class so that the students can see each other's repositories, or private so that students can't see each other's repositories and only the instructor can see the repositories. So if you click this link here, it's a link to the Computer Science 215 GitHub Classroom that I made for our course. And I want you to gain some familiarity with working with the GitHub Classroom with this practice problem. So I have made a essentially Hello World assignment in GitHub Classroom called Classroom Hello World. And here's the invitation link to the assignment. So if you go ahead and click on this link or copy and paste it in your web browser, there'll be instructions about how to set up your repository. Now, this will automatically create the repository, but it's yours to commit to changes to and to manage. And this one is set to be public. This project or assignment is set to be public, meaning all the other students can see your repository, including the instructor. So I will check to see that you are able to interface with GitHub Classroom by hopefully doing the following. Customize the README for your Classroom Hello World repository and push a simple Hello World Python script to Classroom Hello World. And do this from command line on your machine just for extra practice. So in summary, there are many details behind Git that can be overwhelming to try and learn all at once. For this class, I just want to introduce you to the basics and get you to be very comfortable with those basics. And then in the future, when you work on a larger scale project, such as your senior design project or something at an internship, you'll gain more practical exposure to Git and you'll learn the extra details as needed. And I also want to point out that there are several other version control software systems out there, including Subversion and Perforce. In fact, during my undergrad, we learned Subversion, and when I did an internship at Intel, we were working with Perforce. So I've included down here 2 links to really great GitHub cheat sheets. If you can, I recommend printing these and maybe taping them near your computer at home or your desk at work, just so that you can refer to them if need be. Sometimes it can be hard to remember all of the commands, but these are really nice cheat sheets that I recommend you use as well.